Welcome everybody to this afternoon session. So glad you are able to join us as we look at this important topic around the climate changes, with particular emphasis on that which is likely to unfold at the upcoming COP26. So at Henley, we actually look at climate change under the banner of Henley Earth, which essentially stands for environmental activism through research and training. And we look at this topic particularly from an African perspective. We are forever interested in discussing themes and unpacking the impact and the perspective from an African point of view. And we have various panelists and guests that have joined us this afternoon to unpack this very topic. And we have, I'm gonna maybe introduce our Dean and Director who will be hosting us throughout the session. Perhaps, John, I can ask you perhaps to also have the panelists introduce themselves, and we delve straight into the gist of today's session. Thank you so much, and over to you, John.
Thank you very much, and thank you for those who are coming in. As I say, we will record this and use it on social media. We expect it to be something that we use quite a lot over the coming year. So this content is really important, irrespective of how many people are here or not. It's very welcome to see the guests. So this is going to be something that will actually have some leverage, will be really important. My name is John Foster Bedley. I'm the Dean and Director of Henley Business School in Africa. It's my wonderful privilege to host this with the most amazing people we've got. As panelists here, I can't wait to hear from them. I'll be saying a few words after the introduction of the panelists, saying what this is about and why we're doing it. And then after I've said that, we'll have a few minutes from every panelist talking about what they're really concerned of. And it'll be an open and I hope engaging conversation where we're all set for a purpose. But let's go around the panelists. You've got a short time to introduce yourselves in a fascinating way, as I'm sure you will. And so can I start? I think we'll go Brice and then Stanley, then Pato, and then Dipak in that order. Okay, so I was just giving you a moment's warning there, Brice, to say I'm coming to you first, okay? Over to you. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Mr. Deep. Mr. Foster. My name is Brice Hlongwane. I'm a young entrepreneur, currently the Managing Director in Isimangaliso Group, a diverse company with interest in media, technology, renewable energy, and mining. I'm a current student at Henley, studying my ADMP, and I'm a youth activist. I began my youth activism in 2011 at the Durban COP27. I forgot what was it in Durban, but it was COP20 if I'm not mistaken, or COP17. Time has passed. It was COP17 in Durban, and we are now heading to COP26. So I began my youth activism in COP17, where we initiated the Plant a Million Trees in South Africa campaign, and that's why I fell in love with renewable energy, sustainable development, and sustainable growth. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Brice. That's fascinating. So we have a young activist. Thank goodness we have activists. Thank goodness. Okay, and then who did I say I was going to next? Was it you, Brice? I think it was.
I think so. I'm happy to keep on. So hi, everybody. My name is Brice. I am actually an economist by training. I started my career at the World Bank a very long time ago, where I was doing a lot of work on poverty reduction around the world. But then quickly, my steps have taken me to work exclusively on smart cities, which is how technologies can be used by cities and nations in order to tackle a whole range of issues, from congestion to pollution to poverty to waste management. And naturally speaking, having focused a lot on this work of smart city, a lot in Asia and South Asia, my work gradually led me to focus more and more on issues of sustainability and climate change, because a lot of the potential of technologies in Southeast Asia and South Asia is about how to harness the power of new technologies in order to not only tackle issues of climate change mitigation, but as well make countries more able to adapt to climate change, tackle issues of efficient resource management from water to power to even land. And finally, of course, manage waste and enable circularity. So I'm probably much more of a newbie to climate change than most of you. My career path really took me from economic development to technology and now more and more to sustainability, but I'm very excited to be part of the conversation. And just finally, I work for Arup, which is a global engineering and design firm with a very, very long-standing focus on sustainability and climate change issue. And right now is a partner for COP26 in Glasgow. So very nice to be with you all today.
Thank you very much, Brice. And I imagine it's not Brice Richard, but Brice Richard. Is that right?
Brice Richard, exactly. If you want to be very French, you can.
Bienvenue au français ici. Fantastic. Well done. Okay, and then I think I said we come. Thank you so much for that. It's fascinating. But Stanley, I'm going to pick on you next, if you wouldn't mind. Stanley, if you could just say a little bit about yourself and your key interests here. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Deed. My name is Stanley Semelane. I work for the Council for Scientific and Industrial Research in a division called Holistic Climate Change. I'm a senior researcher focusing on climate services. So my current research really focuses on just energy transition, but maybe just to take a few steps back, I started my career at the Central Energy Fund back in 2008, and I used to do CDM projects, Clean Development Mechanism. And that was an initiative under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. So that's where I started my career. Then when the CDM market collapsed, particularly for developing countries like China, South Africa, and Brazil, that's how I moved to the renewable energy sector. Then I spent some time in the energy center within the CSIR. Before that, I used to be a sustainable energy manager, supporting the development of renewable energy projects in the Eastern Cape. But now I find myself back again in the climate change business, but now focusing mainly on mitigation options and adaptation measures against climate change. So that's just me in the nutshell. Thank you so much. I look forward to this discussion.
Thank you, Stanley. I look forward to it as well. So my goodness, the young activist, the economist, the scientist, and now let's come to Pato. It's your turn. Maybe you could just tell us a lot about you.
Hi, everyone. Firstly, thank you for inviting me to join this conversation. My name is Pato Kelesitse, and I'm from Gaborone in Botswana, which is where I currently am. And yeah, a lot of my work is focused on advocating for the environmentally sustainable development of Africa, climate justice, but with a gendered lens. And yeah, a lot of my work includes working with youth and community engagement and communication. So I host the Sustain 267 podcast, which is focused on amplifying the voices of Africans contributing to addressing the climate crisis. This is academia, activists, and just people who are African and have been affected by the crisis. Additionally, I was the coordinator of the Resilient 40, which is a network of about 60 youth of climate activists and professionals across 29 African countries. I'm a global shaper with Gaborone Hub, and I am a climate reality leader trained in 2018 and currently doing my master's in development studies at the University of Botswana.
Thank you. Thank you. That was marvelous. I appreciate it. You also have a strong voice for gender, don't you? That's one of your important advocacies. Am I right about that? Yeah.
Yeah. So as we as we look at climate solutions, we should look at how do they also affect women, because I'm sure like most of us here know, we're all affected, but women are worse affected, which is why we should also have more of their voices on panels like this. Wink, wink, Joe. But yeah.
Well, I absolutely agree, and let's do that in future. And I hope you will attend more of these. I really appreciate it. And finally, Deepak Patel, thank you very much. If you could kindly introduce yourself and your really significant role you're playing now for Southern Africa.
Thank you, Jonathan. I'm Deepak Patel. My background is that I'm a chemical engineer and a former terrorism trialist in the old South Africa. So I also have a very long activist lineage. I then went into the government as Director General of the National Department of Transport when we moved to democracy. I moved into finance and spent something like 15 years in various financial institutions, moving to New York, returned back to South Africa when our now not so new president was elected into office in 2018. And between 2018 and the end of last year, I acted as the special advisor to the Minister of Public Enterprises. 3 months ago, I got pulled into my current role, which is that of Head of Climate Finance and Innovation at the Presidential Climate Commission. In the course of the discussion, I'm sure we'll talk about what the Presidential Climate Commission, fondly known as the PCC, is, and why it is so important that over the next 2 weeks in particular, our country finds a way of getting a consensus and a voice with unison at COP26. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Deepak. And we absolutely, definitely will come back to that. And in quite a lot of detail, I hope, because I think it's a really important framing. And what I'm so pleased about is you have these people on this panel, all of whom are going to be able to do something with what you talk about as well in their different ways. And I'm sure would like to be very much behind these initiatives and support them. Okay, so thank you very much. I'm just going to say a few words about what this is for. And so that butterfly behind me coming out of my head is one form of the blue butterflies. They're fascinating because a lot of their life cycle is spent with ants. The ants take them down the ant's nest. They don't eat them. They secrete secretions to make them ant-like. They actually support the ants. At the end of that, they come out and then they hatch. A lot of those blues do. So most unusual life growth. And I think that, you know, we know so little about nature in so many ways. I mean, I was teasing Tumi because he gave me a photograph of a bee before to put up here. And the bee was actually something that most people don't know about. It wasn't this bee, it was another one. I'll just see if I can get that bee up. That's a bee, but he had something that looks like a bee. It's a hoverfly. And they mimic the bees. They're very fascinating. So we have this wealth of nature, of life around us. We have our communities, and we've been hearing more and more about the challenges of climate change, about the use of fossil fuels, about carbon and methane in the atmosphere, about species extinction, Extinction Rebellion in the UK, and so many more. And what we're sitting with now is the largest ever citizen movement in the history of humanity that is emerging and will only grow more. And that is fighting the evils, as it were, of climate change, the challenges to our environment, to species, to the oceans, etc. Henley is a business school, it's an international business school. And I'm working with my colleagues in Germany, Denmark, and the UK, all of whom have decided to make this year and all the years thereafter a year of activism to support all the movements we can to create a better planet, a better environment for our children. Above my, which year is that? Left here, there is a thing called Henley Earth. That stands for Environmental Activism through Research and Training at Henley. And we intend to be giving scholarships, supporting a dialogue, and taking quite a strong activist position for a business school, really supporting change in the way we do business, what the purpose of business is, concentrating on prosperity rather than just profit, but above all, becoming very, very involved in supporting these activists and helping the voice get out so that they can do their work and we can hear what's going on. So that's what we'll be doing this year. And in December, we'll have a TED Countdown program where we'll be hosting a TED Countdown. We'll last it for half a day, maybe a day, where we'll have some really interesting conversations about how to reduce emissions by 50% by 2030, if indeed that is possible at all. But that's enough from me, totally enough. And I'm going to go back and I'm going to pick on the same order of people because just, you know, you have a bit of a habit there. Now, Bright, yes, it's you. And if you could now, please start with your position on what it is you stand for, why it's important, and what must we do? Okay, over to you. You got 4 minutes, and to me, it's ruthlessly counting down.
Oh, okay, no problem. I'll try and stick to time. So I've been very vocal on my youth years, particularly on the role young people need to play in the political sphere and socio-economic sphere of South Africa. And the common denominator was that we all have a future that we should ensure that is taken care of and is safe. And part of that future relies on us having a vocal voice on climate change and climate change mitigation, because the issue of climate change is definitely going to affect us in the long run. So I've been very vocal. Going back to 2011, I was the one who initiated the Plant a Million Trees, the One School, One Garden project in KZN. And fortunately for me, I was also handpicked by UNICEF to address the world leaders at the COP17, particularly on ensuring that this future of young people is secured and it's safe. And we can't keep on saying young people need to actively lobby governments and industries to emit to reduce their carbon emissions. It should be law, as it was discussed in the Kyoto Protocol and the Paris Agreement, that each and every industry or each and every country needs to reduce emissions at least by 50%. So that's been my standing point for the last ±7 years on saying we young people need to be actively be vocal in terms of issues pertaining to change, because it's our future that is at risk. It will be us that will have faced the dire consequences of sun. It will be us that will have filling up the sea and sea levels rising. So it will be us who will face those consequences. So it should be us leading that conversation, particularly on ensuring that climate change mitigation is done specifically by governments. And we can't only become vocal on social media or socially only. We should go back to the ground, educate people about the issues of climate change, educate people about the dangers of deforestation, because those issues are very important and are very close to us as young people. Because, as I've said, I repeat, we are the ones who are going to face the consequences of the repercussions of climate change. Lastly, currently in South Africa, the president, as Mr. Patel has mentioned, has instituted the Presidential Climate Change Commission. That commission should be given teeth to ensure that each and every recommendation it makes is adhered to, because it's not just an issue of saying we recommend that government should do this. It should be a recommendation also that is going to be enforceable by law, because we work within the prescripts of law. But most importantly, young people should stand up and champion the issues of climate change, because, and as I've said, we are the ones who are going to face the consequences of climate change in the near future, because it's not something 50 years down the line. As we are seeing today, we are faced with rising temperatures, we are faced with rising sea levels, and that only doesn't threaten our future as young people, but the future of our grandchildren, the future of many generations to come. So I lobby all young people to stand up now and start educating themselves about climate change. Those who are not properly educated, they should now start by informing that they take part in education that is for climate change. Thank you.
Thank you, Bright. I've no idea if that was on time, but it sounded like it. We've got a little bit of a sound issue with your mic, so I don't know whether it's the wind or whether it's rubbing on your clothing or something, but probably just the wind there. But we got most of it, so that was really good. I think it might have got all of it, but that was great. So thank you for that. Look, everyone, there's a chat here. You can put comments in there. Please do. Feel free to do that. And I would like now to go to Brice. That was really powerful, Bright. Wonderful. We'll get back to that. Now, Brice, What's your stance? What's your particular thing? How are you contributing? What change are you going to make?
That's a very tough act to follow after Brice. Well, first of all, one critical element that I think it is very important to keep in mind is the focus on climate change mitigation should not lead to tunnel vision about really the environmental challenge that our planet is facing. Reducing GHG emission is only one of the many topics that I think our government needs actually to focus on. Another element which is so far pretty undermined is climate change adaptation. And especially in the countries I live in, a lot of people are increasingly vulnerable to not only rising seawater and flash floods, but as well, increased vector growth that is spreading diseases. You have increases in heat. You have a whole range of elements that is actually threatening food supply chains and other forms of critical supply chain. And while preventing further aggravations to the climate is indeed pretty important, right now it's also pretty important as well for government to take action in terms of adapting and preventing very dire consequences to people's livelihoods, people's happiness, economy, jobs, access to resources that will come no matter what we do in the next 15 years, right? So climate change mitigation is a critical component. It shouldn't overshadow climate change adaptation, and it should not overshadow as well other elements that I think pretty critical to sustainability. And in Arup, we have a very holistic vision of sustainability, which they might not necessarily be part of the scope of COP26, but we always link it because to us, they're part of broader sustainability actions from government. The first one is indeed how to manage waste and pollution overall. And that's really something that is really a ticking time bomb of equal importance to climate change, with the way production methods are going on, the way consumptions of key resources are going on, the way waste is being actually imparted and spread. We have really such a high level of threat on our ecosystem, on our resources, that if we tackle one aspect of the problem and we forget the other one, we're actually going to run into massive environmental issues. So one of the elements that I have is that I'm really about is think about climate as a core component of a broader set of actions that need to be taken into consideration. After that, and that will be my second key point, a lot of the focus on climate action is focused on, you could say, punishment and meeting certain strict requirements that we have. And one of the elements that I think a lot of governments need to wake up to is that actually environmental action, sustainability, climate change adaptation and mitigation are a fundamental economic opportunity. They can actually lead to elements of greening manufacturing sector, greening maritime sector, greening aviation, green finance. All of these elements actually found phenomenal sources of GDP impact, the phenomenal sources of job creations, of new skills, of actually projecting entire economies into the future. So right now, the government should not necessarily approach climate change purely from a fear or meeting, you could say, regulations perspective, but from the fundamental belief that it's actually going to be a core source of future prosperity, future economic growth, and a future workforce. And I think that's very important that we have that perspective as well going forward. John, I don't know if it's more than 4 minutes. That's all from me.
No, that was great. You know what I love about that is that perspective. In such tough times, seeing the potential, the upside potential from these innovations and how it's driving innovations, and the reality that we can't avoid consequences, that we're beyond avoiding consequences. It's now, what can we do and mitigate about it? So that's a really important reality for people, for all of us to share and understand. But I think that was absolutely marvelous, Brice. I wish we must do a lot more of this. Okay, but now it's Stanley, the scientist, coming to the fore. And what does the CSIR have to say? And particularly a South African focus, as well as the global one you will have, won't it be?
Yeah, well, let me just say, before I say anything, say something in my personal capacity. I believe that environmental sustainability should not be a receipt for joblessness, for inequality, for unemployment. That's my personal view. While we also have to acknowledge that the climate science, so the research that we do in the CSIR, really indicates that there is an urgent need to decarbonize. And we've generated a lot of our electricity using coal. Most of our coal fleet has aged. In fact, average age for our power stations, coal power stations, is about 42 years or so. So they're quite old. And if you look at the energy policy in South Africa, particularly the integrated resource plan, you'd see in the 2019 approved IRP that we lose about just over 11,000 megawatts of coal power plants. And those power stations are definitely going to be replaced by renewable energy technology or low carbon technologies. From the climate science point of view, I don't think that is sufficient enough, because if you look the recent climate change report that comes out of the UNFCCC, you see that the 1.5 target we need to do something to reach that target, to try control or manage the temperature, the air temperature that would increase. So there's more work. So that has to be done, particularly to really reduce carbon or greenhouse gas emissions, if you like. That's one. So we're speaking in a country that currently has 34.4 unemployment rate. And my personal view is we normally cry a lot about the employment opportunities that people are going to lose, or the socioeconomic implications of phasing out, or whether you shut down or decommission power stations. But the reality of the matter, even if you try to create new employment opportunities as you phase out or reduce your carbon intensive industries, there's a skills challenge, I think, that has to be really zoomed into, focused into, because these are areas, they're not failing you. We've had the integrated resource plan since 2010, but really the few people participate in this sector in South Africa, and there's a room really to improve, because if you think beyond 2030 and you think of the net zero pathway that everyone is speaking about globally, there is a need then to ensure that even our academic institutions produces graduates that will start to participate in whether it's climate change science opportunities, whether it's more renewable energy opportunities, whether it's climate change early warning systems. And we've seen the impacts in South Africa, for example, in maybe 3-4 years ago, with severe drought that we've seen in the Western Cape that affects productivity, jobs, etc. And yeah, it looks like the climate change risks are increasing, and we have then to do something to make sure that at least we sustain the future for ourselves and the generation that would really come after us. And yeah, I think for now, I will pause there and say, there has to be a balance then to say, how do you manage the potential losses that you would have from particularly the coal economy against, and also you have to think about how to optimize the benefits that would come then with these new technologies that we are adopting. And we cannot optimize in 1 year, and we are also not closing our coal power stations in 1 year. So you're not closing all of them, but we'll gradually phase them out, and we have an opportunity then to think about, to say how it's going to start to increase probably localization opportunities, where we start to manufacture components like electrolyzers and other components that would be required as we decarbonize the entire country's energy system, including the transport sector as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Stanley, thank you so much. I just saw Tumi getting slightly anxious there as he was on the edge of his seat as we were coming to the end of the time, but that was all right, well done. So that's very interesting, and I love the thought that we have to think about this as being potentially job generating. But Deepak, I'm going to do two things with you, so please take your 4 minutes, but what I'd like to do is also give you a little extra time to introduce another thing as well, and that's a little bit more about the country's ambitions and the presidential initiative you're on, and open up from there. From out there, we're going to be asking questions of people and throwing it around. So Deepak, over to you. Thank you very much. Thanks so much for the contribution so far. Wait a minute. I'm going to go after, sorry, I got that wrong. Before you go, Deepak, I actually want to get a hold of Pato first. Because
Sure.
otherwise the presidential one will stretch on and we'll be lost. And I would really love, I thought maybe afterwards, I changed my mind at the last moment. So sorry. Pato, please go ahead now, because I think your voice will actually contextualize what Deepak's going to say. Apologies for that.
All right, so my opening statement on our road to COP26, I'll speak more in relation to the work that I do and what we need to do continentally, I would say. So my work is focused on communicating climate change, breaking down the science, making it make sense. So the brilliant work that Stanley and all the other scientists do, we come in and we make it conversation. And as we head to COP26, I think what's important is for us to understand our agenda as Africans. And as much as, yes, we're all going for climate change solutions and we're going for addressing climate change, what does it mean to us? I think earlier might have been Bright touched on how we need to maintain 1.5 as per the IPCC report. But what does that mean for Africa? We are way past 1.5. 1.5 globally doesn't mean 1.5 in Africa. And how does that translate for us? When we go to COP right now, what is our message? What is our message as Africans? What is our message as African youth? Our message as African women, African activists? What do we want to say? And we need to all say it together and be on the same page. And my response on when it comes to all being on the same page is we need to consume African. We need to consume the messages of Africa as we go for COP. Where are Africans writing? You've got the Daily Maverick, which does a great job of capturing what's going on in South Africa in terms of climate change and the like. You've got articles being run in the South African Mainland Guardian. Let's read that. If you want to read a little bit broader, look at what's happening in some other parts of Africa. If you want to listen to podcasts, listen to maybe the Africa Climate Conversations podcast. They do a great job of capturing what's Africa's message as we go to COP26. Don't just listen to the global experts. There's Jamal, I don't quite know how to pronounce his name, Jamal Jamoy. Dipak, I feel like you'd know him, the head consultant for the negotiation team. Do you know him, Dipak?
Ours or the global?
Ours. Sorry, his name just completely escaped.
We will discover his name and share it in a minute. Okay.
I'm going to type it. I know how to spell it. I just don't know how to pronounce it. But yeah, okay. So as we go there, we all need to be on the same page of what do we want and what does what we want mean for us, and not just jump onto the global northern bandwagon. They need to talk emissions. We need to talk resilience, mitigation, and adaptation. They need to take out the money. We need to see what we're going to do if and when they take out the money. But yeah, that's it from me. Our narrative needs to be African. The road to COP needs to be an African road to COP. That's it.
Well, that's an incredibly empowering quote. The road to COP needs to be an African road. Narrative needs to be African. I so agree, and I think let's have that ambition for this coming year. Now, Deepak, you've had these 4 voices, and there you are, bringing together this a really powerful initiative. Let's see how this lands with you and how we serve this.
That is a really tough act to follow, Jonathan. I think the president knew what he was doing when, using his executive powers, he announced and created the Presidential Climate Change Coordinating Council in December. I think, as I also mentioned to you previously, Jonathan, at this point in time, it is not a statutory structure, but a commission appointed by the president. However, as something called the Climate Bill, which has now been passed and adopted by cabinet, goes through the parliamentary process. As you know, we have very lively democracy in South Africa. The Presidential Climate Change Coordinating Council will in fact get statutory powers once it becomes an act. In the meanwhile, leading up to COP26, and this is where I think the president did have the foresight to see that what we needed was a unified South African voice going into COP26. And to Pato's point, obviously we're attempting to get a coordinated African voice, and you will know that something called COP Africa is scheduled for next year. However, I think the fundamental issues related to the, I would say, inequality that exists within the world, but more particularly within the developing world as it relates to issues which Stanley has already spoken about. Unemployment largely concentrated in the youth sector, the need for job growth as well as economic growth, the need as we decarbonize to ensure that this trajectory of ours is what we are now coining a just transition. So it is not only biodiversity that matters, it is not only the environment as the West understands it to be pristine living conditions and wildlife, etc., that matters. This is an entire system that needs to be tackled in unison. I think the political message, because geopolitics, as you know, is a critical function at COP26, and in fact, COPs prior to that, in fact, we had disasters. You might remember Copenhagen broke down. You might remember Durban was in fact a watershed moment, to Brice's point, because what it put firmly on the agenda was this notion of a just transition. What it put firmly on the agenda is in fact the voice of youth, not just global Northern Hemisphere youth, but in fact the youth of the global South, who might have different issues that affect them, and therefore their voices needing to be heard. What I also want to say is that Cabinet adopted on the 14th of this month a revised NDC. There's lots of terminology, lots of jargon. NDC is nationally determined contribution. And in that NDC, we are quite ambitious in terms of what we are putting on the table as can be achieved as South Africa's contribution to a pathway to net zero in 2050. At the risk of becoming very technical, people have on this panel already talked about 1.5 degrees versus 2 degrees Celsius. We've also talked about, in technical terms, something called net zero CO2 equivalent by 2050. However, South Africa is now putting on the table, subject to certain conditions, a progressive achievement of those targets. And so for the first time, we are committing to a trajectory that sees us work within a certain band of CO2 emissions up to 2025, and then another band up to 2030 to net zero CO2 equivalents in 2050. But, and this is the big but, Jonathan, we're going as a country with an offer to COP26 on condition that the developed world come to the party as well. They cannot expect the developing world to forego its own development trajectory, its own quest for zero unemployment, its own quest for GDP growth, and its own quest to have a bright and climate resilient future on its own, where the developed world has already, in our opinion, been the largest portion of responsible emitters over the last century that have in fact taken us to 2 degrees Celsius global warming and potentially beyond that. And so I'm going to say, rowing my boat out without a mandate, that COP26 is as much about activism, and it is as much about science, and it is as much about money as it is about getting a consensus that we're in this boat together, and that those parts of the world that have benefited from a carbon-intensive trajectory for their development cannot expect the developing world to forego natural endowments like coal in the ground, natural endowments like, let's just say, access to cheaper sources of energy, unless, of course, the developed world comes to the party and makes possible what we call a green economic growth trajectory that allows countries like South Africa, other countries in Africa, other countries in what we call the global South to undertake a path to their development, growth, job creation that is greener and therefore less pollution or less polluting, less emitting than the path that the developed world has traversed. Which leads me to the final point, and that is also an emerging part of my portfolio in the Presidential Climate Commission. And in fact, Brice has talked about mitigation and adaptation. We are quite lucky in South Africa that we've gone past what we call the learning curve as it relates to PV generation, as it relates to wind generation. And the critical challenge now, to Stanley's point, is to find a way of reducing the emissions that come from Eskom's coal-powered power stations to moving in the direction of mitigating technologies that allow us to grow our electricity and power, let's just call it security and reliable availability, while at the same time ensuring that the what we would call the primary energy sources for that electricity and power generation is greener and cleaner. But if we are asking Eskom, for example, to accelerate the rate at which the coal-fired power stations need to be shut down compared, again, to what Stanley said is contained in the current IRP 2019, then that amounts to, in essence, a need for concessionary finance and, in fact, grant financing to be able to pay for an early shutdown of assets that have already been invested in. I'm going to stop there, Jonathan, and I think I've said a mouthful, but as you can see, we're in this boat together from a variety of different sectors, from a variety of different generations, and we are all concerned about whether, in fact, as humanity, we can, especially in the developing world and especially in Africa, make a contribution to decarbonization and a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions while we undertake a path to prosperity for our own people, both as a country and as a continent. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Deepak. That was superb. I think what we've had now is different perspectives. We've set the scene for something that's coming up. You've raised issues of just transition, net zero, about the balance of activism, finance, science, and a need to have that done in a way that's equal. We've raised the need to have an African voice. Now, here we are, here we are. And what should we do? We've got COP coming up. So I want to get the activist gene activated in all of us now and start talking about some of the things that we can practically do that aren't just about terrifying people, but are motivational, inspiring, or whatever. So I'm not going to go in any particular order here. I saw Stanley leap forward in his chair at that point, so I'm going to pick on him. What have you got to say, Stanley? Then I'll pick on the rest in a minute.
Thank you. Thank you, Jonathan. I think Dipak hit it on the nail. We understand that we need to do something, to reduce carbon emissions or greenhouse gas emissions. But we also have socio-economic challenges in South Africa. We are an equal society. So maybe two things that South Africa could potentially achieve in Glasgow would be, one, a deal on just energy transition, and that's funding. That deal is about making sure that You would have social protection plans for the potential losers. If you want to accelerate closing coal power stations, our current power utility is not in a good financial position. So if they're going to close some of those infrastructure earlier than they've planned, what will happen to those debts? So that is the deal that has to be made from a climate finance point of view, but also from a social economic upliftment point of view. That's one. Two, adaptation is a game changer. South Africa has stepped forward in terms of the mitigation targets that they put forward on the updated NTDC. Globally, everyone can see that, but you're going to require funding for us to be able to go to that path. The current infrastructure that we have, so if you see in our NTDC, there's an adaptation element that tells you, and on that NTDC, we only focus on key priority sectors, biodiversity, settlement, not even the entire sectors. To say if you were to, for example, put smart drainage system as an adaptation measure for floods, how much would that cost? And to quantify that number, I only focused on the projection of RDP houses that would be built, not everything else, not the private properties and other thing else that will be developed. So even those numbers that you see there on the adaptation costs, they don't even reflect the entire adaptation finance that would be required. But at least you have a start, you have the current infrastructure that you'll have to maintain, and climate risk would have impact in that. And moving forward, you'll have to do things smarter, whereby you'll have these resilient crops for agriculture, you'll have to have all these shades that you require for certain crops, and you also have to build dams. South Africa is a water scarce country, for example. All that requires finance. So those are the two things I would say: just transition finance and adaptation being put forward.
Well, and that's really powerful, and those are the things we have to hold in our head. But what really fascinates me, Dipak was a financer. He's in charge of finance for this, and that's going to come out. And I'm sure that Brice and Pato have got a view on this just transition. So I'm going to come to you, Brice, quickly, but just chip in if you want to say something. Anyone, stick up your hands. The hand motif is there under your reactions. Put them up. So Brice, what have you got to say about this? How are we going to make this happen now? How do we move from the abstract to the concrete and get the results?
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, that's great.
Thank you. I think the greatest thing we can do moving forward is educating people in and around South Africa and in the global community about the consequences of climate change. Climate education is very important because people deep down in the rural areas of South Africa are not well versed on what climate change is and what they can do in terms to mitigate it. Also, I echo the same sentiments as Mr. Semelane. Climate finance is very important because as a growing economy, we can't have funding for everything we want to do. So the big economies, because they are the big emitters, they need to come into the fore and say, we can assist you here and there. Lastly, apart from education and training, we need to ensure that every stakeholder involved in the climate change mitigation and adaptation is given a chance to thoroughly unpack their roles, because there's this confusion between climate change activists, climate change enthusiasts, because there's that war of ideas, and the battle of ideas is much better because there's no fighting for no good. And I think a battle of ideas is very important now for us to understand that each and every idea that is put in front is going to benefit South Africa going forward. And on the road to COP26, I think it's also very important to ensure that the education card is held high, because without education, we are moving forward in a backward manner. Thank you.
Thank you, Brice. And okay, so I'm getting quite excited about this thought that we're over the next few months as COP comes, we start putting more people together, we develop this voice, and we have a voice for COP Africa, but we do more in the near future as well. And we pull corporates in, we support Dipak and the president in his work. And we combine the South African work with the Botswana work and beyond. So over to you, Pato. What are you feeling now?
So as you were talking to the just transition, and because we're on the conversation of the just transition, my views on it are it needs to, once again, we need to translate it to practicality. There's this cartoon that I saw recently that talked about, I don't know, something about geoengineering water, and these scientists were telling these African women with water on their heads about how, you know, this tool, it like finds the water and it does the things. And all they asked the scientist was, will it carry the water? So I think that translates to the just transition, because it's like whatever we employ has to work for the people, which is why, like Stanley said, like Deepak said, we then in our solutions need to continue to run with the just transition. And then in terms of solutions of what we can do as we go forward, like I said earlier, my work is around communicating. We need to be more intentional around the knowledge that we get from Africa. So we should be reading African, we should be citing African, we should be consuming African context. We should consider the African story more. We can't have a just transition if there are certain stories about Africa that are not being told, if there are certain pockets that are not being told. Right now, as we talk about divesting from coal and the like, someone is going to think, but I was talking to someone who's part of a community-based organization in South Africa, and they were like, no, we're happy. Can you hear me?
The passion has been slightly crushed by the connectivity issues, but
all right. Is it better? Is it better with my camera off?
Yes, it is. It is vocally.
Great.
Yes.
All right. So lost my train of thought there, but I think I was speaking to the practicality of, as we're talking about divesting, then how do the people who support divestment get solar energy to them? I was recently talking to someone from a CBO in Ekurhuleni, and they were saying, no, we're happy to divest. In fact, we don't even have proper electricity. We already have this land that we can't even use for anything because it used to be for mining. Let's put panels on there. But where do they go to say, can we have some panels? Let's start being more practical. We talk about all these beautiful solutions. Let's bring them to action. Let's put panels. Let's put panels in areas where people can't afford electricity, so that even as we divest from coal, we're already telling people this is where we are taking you. And that's me. Those are my thoughts on our just transition.
Thanks very much. And so what's come up several times now is issues around financing and the economy and how we make this work. Now, Brice, you're an economist with a global view. You've worked all the way around the world. And so, and you've worked for major institutions, finance and aid bodies. This must be something you've considered in depth. And you know what it's like. You know, I don't know what it's like in those institutions, but it is very much that we in Africa, and I'm an adopted African. I mean, I was British originally 30 years ago, but I've been brought up with kids here now, so I'm very much my future here. You must be thinking about this. Like, how do we make this work now? Because as Dipak says, it's madness to assume that the developing world must take on the burden of all the climate change when a developed world has benefited from the carbon, their economies, and are now in comfortable positions, if relatively they might not seem like to them. Why should we be stuck as we are with a vaccine kind of deficit? Why must we be stuck with a climate and sustainability deficit? How do you think that can work in real life? No motherhoods, truth.
If I had the answer to that question, John, I'd be a billionaire today. Listen, Dipak is way more of an expert on this than I am. But my sense from what I've seen, from what I've experienced, is that there are some real trade-offs and there are some fake trade-offs, right? The real trade-offs are indeed the ones that say, that forces countries that are on their path to economic development to make choices in terms of industries that they've developed or energy sources that they use that will impact their competitiveness over time or in the short run. And it's very difficult for a country like, Vietnam, for example, to say, you know what, we're going to forget about all this investment in coal that we've done. We're going to focus entirely on renewable energy, and we're going to basically get rid of all the polluting and high emission industries that we basically built our economy on. Why? Because a lot of these industries are actually labor intensive. They're right now providing skills and salaries to Vietnamese people who are trying to move up the value chain and the salary chain. And saying from our perspective, or my perspective as a European, you should forget about it is of course is a bit disingenuous, right? So I think a lot of countries need to approach this discussion from the perspective of understanding the economic development path that other countries, middle income countries, low income countries actually in, and understand the reality of this and help them through that, and then maybe absorb some of the downside, so that basically the value proposition is mostly upside. However, you do have a lot of trade-offs that are fake trade-offs. And it's a lot of trade-offs where indeed are saying, well, there is a choice to be made between reducing carbon emissions and necessarily creating job creation or creating industries that are putting our countries in the path to the future. And it's not always the case, and in many cases, it's not the case, because a lot of fast-growing industries are actually in areas that actually in low emissions and have very high value added. Now, do countries like Cambodia, for example, have the skills to necessarily develop that, or is it labor intensive enough to basically absorb a lot of portion of the population? Is a conversation worth having, but there is a lot of opportunities actually to explore that. But a lot of these conversations are actually started by a lot of the industries that are capturing a lot of the political institution in a lot of countries. And because of vested interest, you have some decisions that are being made under the guise of these trade-off debate that essentially end up cementing for the long run some very poor climate change related decision. And I think it's quite important to be able to be mindful of the equations and the fake ones, and call them out on the fake ones. And it's pretty hard sometimes to disentangle both, because you have to understand the economic structure of all the countries. Now, one thing that is quite clear, however, and a lot of people are mentioning this in terms of, Deepak was mentioning climate finance and green finance. In Southeast Asia, one of the critical issues that we have is clearly an infrastructure gap, right? Where you have trillions of dollars of infrastructure that are waiting to be built in the next 10 years. A lot of them are actually sustainable infrastructure. I think there's several trillion of sustainable infrastructure potentially in the pipeline, but these projects are actually dying for money, right? Because these projects, it's not that they're not bankable, but they're not bankable as much as other, you could say, projects that are not sustainable or not happening in other countries. So it's, you could say, a relative comparison of how bankable or profitable certain projects are. I think the development of a vibrant green finance sector that with pockets of money that are earmarked, with as well impacts that go beyond basic return on investment, but take into account, ESG and broader perspective, actually would naturally lead large amounts of capital to be invested in countries. And I think technically actually would cut the whole, trade-off, because a lot of money actually would chase profitable projects and would lead, countries like Southeast Asian countries, and I'm sure a lot of African countries, and my apologies for not being one, to actually develop infrastructure that is sustainable, really tackle the decarbonization of the power sector, of the construction sector, of the whole range of infrastructure related emissions. And I think that's quite exciting. And the work that Deepak is doing from that perspective is absolutely critical. and understanding how the money flows is really going to maybe break some of these debates and break the deadlock between that idea of climate change comes at the expense of competitiveness and economic development is quite hopefully encouraging, and we've seen it already. The creation of carbon markets is already assigning value to carbon emissions. The development of green finance is assigning value to impact, climate change impact type of action. In my sense, this is where a lot of the catalysts actually could potentially come from. But I'll let the real experts talk on the issue.
Thank you very much, Brice. Before we go to Deepak, I just want to highlight a couple of things you said that I thought were particularly important. One was this concept of bankable projects. You know, I mean, that because they create a profit in the short term, but we're talking about issues here that are not bankable in the medium term if climate change affects the profitability. And this is why pandemic protection is not bankable. At least it wasn't 2 years ago. It certainly probably would be now. You know, and this, the perception change about what happens when the commons get destroyed, as we're looking at now, that changes the nature of the economics. And maybe that's part of it. And maybe that's where activism, where some of the activism really plays a part. You know, people rail against the people sitting on roads and doing the other things. And they become very unpopular, but there's no question that activism has played a part in raising consciousness, as it has in any major revolutionary or change movements. But I know somebody who knows a lot more about that than I do. But is that what you're trying to say? Is that the sort of position? Yeah.
John, sorry, you're raising a very important point. Just mentioned that 5 seconds. There is an entire new portion of economics that has been emerging and growing like gangbusters in the last 5-10 years, is the quantification of intangibles. And it's a whole stream of thinking around environmental accounting and natural accounting, and the ability to incorporate within valuation processes and impact processes, as you say, the loss of common or the valorization of natural assets. Because right now, a lot of the valuation elements, or you could say the cost that some people bear versus the revenue that they're getting, is actually really focused on a couple of very narrow sources of value. Because certain intangibles, you could say the value of certain intangibles right now is invisible to a lot of models. And I think what you were talking about precisely presses on that issue, because that would change the bankability landscape radically if we were to have that ability to value these components.
Thank you, Brice. And that's where the activism, the advocacy comes in, because it makes those intangibles suddenly feel more immediate and more tangible, doesn't it? Yeah. Okay, but Deepak, over to you, please. You've got, and I'd love you to touch on COP26 as well. What do you think South Africa can get out of it?
I think Brice is raising some important issues. Having said that, though, you know, I think the world is in this together, and we have a sense per capita of where the future emissions lie, and therefore what needs to be abated. Now, I know we're using a lot of big words here. So abatement refers to where are the opportunities, in fact, to stop carbon emissions. And the reality, as much as Brice is raising issues with respect to Vietnam and Cambodia, etc., the reality in the world as far as abatement is concerned is that there are certain developing countries which have a clear trajectory of industrial, mining, and manufacturing-led development paths which are well articulated and which at this point in time are premised on fossil fuels being used as a primary energy source for that development plan. So let's not conflate issues here. Okay, the developing world requires paths to development. However, not all of the developing world can assist the rest of the world to abate carbon like certain other economies. So let's also stop the false narrative that developing countries are all in the same basket. There are developing countries which can make a huge contribution by being assisted to, in fact, preserve and deepen their biodiversity. There are other developing countries which have clearly articulated industrial growth paths, which at this point in time are premised on coal. which at this point in time might be premised and reliant on natural gas. If these countries are expected to keep those natural endowments either in the ground or elsewhere beneath the seabed, someone has to pay for that. And that's what this COP is all about. Who wants what from which developing country? And I can say that on the African continent, there's a handful of countries which per capita can make a much larger contribution to abating future carbon than other countries can. And let's be realistic about this. South Africa is one of those. And if the world wants South Africa to undergo a greening of its mining industry, a greening of its steel making industry, a greening of its electricity production, which at this point in time are all invested either through natural endowments or through assets that must actually net present value be paid for. So I know we're speaking in a lot of jargon here, Jonathan, but
no, this is really good. Yeah.
We're going
Excellent.
to COP26 with a relatively well quantified number that says this is the lifespan of our power stations. As much as they close to end of life, a lot of them, if you want us to close them earlier, this is what it's going to cost. This is our natural endowment as it relates to the investment we've already made in the coal mining sector, not only by cutting the box cuts that give us coal, but in the Mpumalanga region, the kind of value chains that the coal industry support, both with respect to communities reliant on that value chain, people who are directly employed by that value chain, either in the coal mines or in associated industries, but just as importantly, the small businesses and micro industries and microeconomies that exist around the production, mining of coal and the utilization of coal in the value chain. These need to be quantified. If you want those regions to stop mining coal or reduce the extent to which that coal is mined to a point where they are not mined anymore, and the date that is being given under certain conditions is maybe 2040, 2045, then we can't leave those regions destitute. Someone has to now assist those regions to move into different value chains. And those value chains might not be in energy. Those value chains, to Pato's point, might be in the production of efficient agricultural yielding crops assisted by novel forms of new water sources, novel forms of new energy sources. And these are all things that in the Presidential Climate Commission, we're beginning to unpack, understand, quantify, so that we're not just speaking in generalities about assist us, please, as we move to new development paths. We are actually saying these are viable development paths as alternatives to the development paths that are fundamentally premised, founded on a notion that we are going to go with a coal-driven economic growth path. And then of course comes industry. I want to then say that South Africa is beginning to develop a reasonably clear sense that firstly, as Stanley said, we need to decarbonize electricity production. Secondly, remember when we talk about motor vehicles, a lot of people think we're only talking about the elite in South Africa. Not true. The motor vehicle industry in South Africa, in large part, is not for the domestic market, but in fact, a production capability that is now exporting vehicles to the rest of the world. Whether we're talking about BMWs, whether we're talking about Toyotas, whether we're talking about Mercedes-Benzes, there are entire ranges of those vehicles, internal combustion engine vehicles, that at the moment contribute massively by way of jobs, by way of GDP, by way of value add. If we're now saying that internal combustion engines are going to come to an end in Europe, what does that mean for the South African manufacturing industry in motor vehicles? And therefore, what is our path then to a manufacturing capability for electric vehicles following on a greening of electricity? Then, of course, we're talking about greening all of our manufacturing and mining. But all of that can happen if, as Stanley says, we start with the fundamental premise that we can, in fact, change Eskom and our electricity sector to a more green form. And I'll come back to green because we're seeing gas as an intermediate step to full-blown renewables. But this is all part of our industrial development program, which if it is quantified, costed, has a gap, to Brice's point, in the macroeconomic sense of a funding gap. So there are individual projects, but there's also a portfolio. And what we're trying to say at COP26 is that this comes as a package. This comes as a country package reflected in our nationally determined contribution, eyes wide open about the socio-economic development path that we as a country need to undertake, no longer in 5-year plans, but in fact in 30 and 50-year plans. And that if we are to undertake this journey, this is what the developed world must make as a contribution, as an investment in abating carbon firstly, but also assisting the South African development roadmap to be greener than it otherwise would be.
Thank you very much. There's such critical points. Sorry about the muting. I was lost in thought as you were speaking, because each one of those are such important streams to unpack in this coming year. And each one of them is critical. I mean, we look at Brazil. Why should Brazil? How can we stop the destruction of the Amazon there? What is the quid pro quo there? You know, I mean, appalling though it is, how can we do something about Eskom? So what are we going to do about Mozambique and its gas? You know, all those huge questions which you're raising. Particularly, maybe we should build a gigafactory out there by Sunderland, by the array where it is. You know, I mean, we have all the raw materials. What can we do here that's different? So there's really.
If I may, Jonathan, I'm really sorry, because Pato is from Botswana. I just want to say I was in the Delta recently. If the world wants the Delta to continue to provide the amazing biodiversity and natural filter for clean water running all the way from the highlands of Angola all the way to the Delta in Botswana, we must all come together. We can't expect Botswana alone to keep the Delta alive forever. So that's another case in point. Multi-country, multi-jurisdictional, and not industrial, but in fact biodiversity oriented, needs an investment.
You've just started a whole new movement, keeping the Delta alive, and I'm on board. Pato.
Yeah, I actually wanted to add to what Deepak just said right now about Okavango. If you're on this call and you don't know what's going on in the Okavango right now, there's fracking for oil in one of the most pristine areas in the world by Recon Africa, which is a Canadian company. Please go and Google Save the Okavango Delta, or just look up the hashtag Save the Okavango on whichever your preferred social media is, and help us try to stop the fracking in the Okavango, because that's going to be completely irreversible. It's already happening, but we need to stop it now before it gets any worse. I know Prince Harry spoke out against it. The UN has tried to speak out against it because there was a part that was covered by the World Heritage Sites. But please, please, please do look it up, add your voice, tweet about it, and help us save the Okavango, not only for the people of Botswana and the indigenous people who rely on that water source, but for the whole world. We need the Okavango to continue to exist in its current form. Sorry to take us on a tangent, and Dipak, thank you for mentioning that.
Please go there, because that's a wonderful, I mean, look, we talk abstract, but sometimes we need vehicles to bring people together. It might not be the straightest course. Sometimes we go there. That's a powerful one. It's going to help Botswana. It's going to help Angola. It's going to help, Angola. It's going to help Namibia. It's going to help South Africa. And it'll help all the countries. And it'll be an example to the world of people coming together in Southern Africa on a major initiative of huge importance for nature and the natural world. So I think that's a great idea. So I'm on board already. So let's no, from your speak, I'm fully fired up on this. Look, we've only got a few minutes left, and I really appreciate what's been said here. And we're going to record this, take some bits out. But also, Andre, I see you popping up there. I'm going to ask you if you want to ask a question. Also, we're going to do a graphic facilitation of this, the key threads, which we'll share and unpack over a while. A guy called James Durner is doing that. You may know, he's tremendous. Andre, did you have something you wanted to ask? I saw you unmuted yourself. Always dangerous to do in a conference. Okay, maybe not. So before we close off, so any questions from anybody? Martin, I see you there. Zuzile, Kevin, Matthew. Any questions? This is a great opportunity to ask those questions. You don't always have a chance to ask of anyone here. So please put them down if you want to, or just unmute yourself. I'll just give you a second to do that in case anyone would like to. Okay, don't worry, we'll get there.
John, I don't think we do enough of this. This is education at its best, where people can be taught about what otherwise would be something that happens behind closed doors and closed conferences, where only people that are really interested about this attend. And I think this is a gap, and maybe this is the start of a good opportunity for us to collaborate and see if there's any other of these topics that we can use, you know, that otherwise would be kept quiet behind curtains and doors, and you know. So thank you. I felt really inspired by this.
Thank you, Jacques. And I'm looking at the people on the screen here, and we make an awful lot of heroes in our life, and we build a lot of idols. I mean, what a waste of time. Why don't we make heroes and idols and PR these people? You know, the Patos and the Brices and the Brices and the Stanleys and the Dipaks. Why don't we put our energies to put their voices louder? I mean, it's tough on you because you've got to become public figures even more. But actually, this is where we're sitting, isn't it? So how are we going to become more activists? So I'm going to say we've only got 7 minutes. If we could go around with a couple of closing comments. And as I said, this is just the beginning of what I hope will be a decent dialogue going on for a long time. And we certainly want to support this. It's been wonderful. So Dipak, I'm going to give you the last word again. And I'm going to say Stanley, Brice, Bright, Pato, Deepak. We'll go in that order. Just a few closing comments and a stirring call to action, or whatever it is you want to do.
Yeah, thank you, Jonathan. I think my closing remarks, I think it's important to work in a multi approach, particularly if you think of the SADC region and the African continent. And mainly one of the reasons I say that is you'd find that the South African power system is about 40 gigawatts in terms of size. And if we start to compare ourselves with India, China, we are just a fraction relative to their size. So in terms of economies of scales, on some of the technologies that you could start to manufacture locally, you might not have a business case, but if you factor in the sub-Saharan region and all other countries, there might be a valid business cases in terms of the type of components that would probably manufacture moving forward. So it's important for us then to approach this climate change and low carbon economy, not just only for our local economies, but also to think about how can we work together with other African countries. Thank you.
Thank you, Stanley. That's really helpful. Appreciate it. And you as a CSIR, holding all the research and building it up, we'll work with you. Maybe you can come up with some compelling international research we can share as well. Thank you. Brice, over to you. Your last calls to action. And I see there's a comment for you, Pato, later you can answer. Okay.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I was trying to think about something interesting to say, but I realized it's all been said here in Singapore, and my brain stopped thinking around like an hour and a half ago, as you probably have noticed. But I mean, first of all, to me, my main call to action is exactly what everybody was talking about, and I was especially inspired by what Pato was basically talking about, by talking about call for activism and the amount. I mean, I've come to climate change pretty recently. It's only been a couple of years, but I've seen indeed like a radical shift in the importance is taken in the public debate, and the way now it is actually taking permanence. Even like in my daughter's school, she's 6 years old there, so a 6-year-old and an 8-year-old, and they're already talking about climate change at an early age. And so I know it's an easy cop out, but the mere fact that my daughters are talking at that age and it's really already being part of their reality and their narrative that something needs to be done is probably what's going to be shifting things around beyond the technology, beyond green finance. At the end of the day, it's a numbers game. It's people in the street, it's people going to COP, it's people like Pato and everybody else actually building a strong voice and not letting anybody get away with really people holding governments and private sector accountable. So I'm just a witness to all this, but I'm very excited to see that happening.
Thank you. And I think you're being overly humble. Your brain certainly didn't stop working. I got a lot out of it. So it was really helpful. I really appreciate it. Okay, been really great points. Brice, over to you.
Thank you, sir. I think my closing remarks will be on let's move together as a pack. I'm meaning that let's constantly educate all those who are not part of this discussion, all those who don't have the means to take part in conferences and discussions like this, so that we can all be in the same level. As I've said earlier, education is the most critical part in everything, or in basically the cornerstone of the climate change and adaptation. We should try and make means, educate those who are not available digitally, educate everyone, especially the kids. Go back to grassroots level, go to primary schools, go to secondary schools, empower young people, empower students, empower learners to also take part in initiatives that are pro-climate adaptation and mitigation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Brice. And as a reward for your attendance here, we're going to send you a mic with a sound muffler on it, so you can plug it in. And we'll send something to everybody, because your voice needs to be heard. I really appreciate it. Okay. Pato.
Hi, everyone. So I just saw some questions for me in the chat. Firstly, on the Okavango Delta, we did an episode on it a few months ago. If anyone hasn't heard about it and would like to appreciate it, I just shared the link to the episode in the chat. And then Jean, you asked what the issues like the Okavango Delta, if issues like the Okavango Delta will be discussed at COP. Probably, but not by our, probably not by our government, because they've shied away from the conversation quite a bit. Even for the conversation to be centered now, they have been quite removed from it, and the only communication on it is defense. So if people say something and then they come and defend it, so we don't know what we're taking to COP26. Our message at COP26 hasn't been shared yet, so we really don't know we're really not sure what's going to go on there. And then what's the role of African youth in the upcoming COP? It's to put pressure on our leaders. It's to share what's happening throughout the continent with the little, very small platform that's extended to us, because when we're talking about youth involvement now, especially on platforms that matter, where people are listening, it's very rare for it to be African voices. We've got Vanessa, who does now have a platform, but we've got probably 3 African youth who are given relevant platforms. So I guess it's for us to act on social media. A lot of African youth couldn't get funding to go, couldn't get accreditation to go. So if you can and you want to hear the voices of African youth, try and follow them on social media. I'm going to share one more thing after this. I've curated a list of African youth on climate change on Twitter that you can follow, and I'm going to share that. And then my last words, my very, very last words, before I share how you can keep in touch with me and support my work. Please, as we continue to go forward and trying to address climate change and trying to craft the African message, read African content, cite Africans in academia, consume African content on your social media, share their content. If you can, donate to make sure that we're still continuing to produce blogs and independent papers that can tell the story as it is and not as the funder would rather it were. Thank you so much for sharing this platform. I'll share my contact and how you can support my work in the chat. Joe and Henley, thank you so much for inviting me to be a part of this.
Won't be the last time. It won't be the last time at all, Pato. So let us know what you want. And I just want to thank you all for those comments. And in a sense, it's very interesting because Dipak is leading role in this presidential commission, which is moving from South Africa and elsewhere. I heard a lot of voices. And I guess sometimes it must be a bit of a challenge for you. You feel you've got all these people to kind of resolve, Dipak, and all these kind of constituencies to represent and move. I mean, I'm not going to put it all on you because we're going to support. Maybe you should say how you feel we should move forward, what your last words are, and how we can support you.
Thank you, Jonathan. Let me say that COP26 is going to be a make or break, and that's not a melodramatic statement. It's going to be make or break because, as people said earlier, the scientists have spoken, and it's beyond any doubt now that the climate effects of 100 odd years of behavior, environmental behavior, industrial behavior, etc., is taking us to the brink. That we as developing countries, South Africa and Africa in particular, need to make our contribution to let's just say, fight climate change, but just as importantly, to prepare our societies to be climate resilient, because we know that that horse has bolted. We're going to COP26 as a South African group that is quite unified over the next week. I think the Minister of Environment, of Forestry, Fisheries and Environment will in fact let the country know what it is that we're taking to COP as a country position. The Presidential Climate Commission has played quite a critical role over the last 4 or 5 months in ensuring that we've created the dialogue platforms in which all of society, at least South African society, sectors, women, youth, academics, scientists, and politicians were able to come together and make their voices heard. And we have forged, I think, a reasonable consensus as South African society that says a couple of things. Number one, we are committed to mitigating and adapting to climate change. We are committed to ensuring that, at least in the South African context, ours is going to be a just transition. We are committed to a development path that ensures that we put all of the climate issues, whether it be biodiversity, whether it be jobs, whether it be development, whether it be encouraging and promoting young people and women in all of the value chains that form our development path towards a greener future, we're committed to that. I know that's a lot of commitment, but remember that as a country, our future is in our hands, whether the West assists that future or not. However, we are saying at COP26, if you expect us to have a greener path to our development than you've had over the last 150 years, and you're finding it difficult now to abate the next gram, leave alone metric ton of carbon, then you had better also, for want of a better word, Brice said it quite nicely, understand that you have had a negative impact and that there has to be some payback for that.
Thank you, Dipak, and thank you so much for those wise words and for that call to action. I think what we've seen here is something that used to be on the fringe, moving not just slightly into the mainstream, but fully into the mainstream. As a business school, we have an obligation to educate leaders and managers, and we're going to do that. And we're going to do it with taking these issues on, not shying away from them. We're going to make this part of what we do. If we fail or we suffer in the process, then so be it. But this is something we have to support. I'd like to thank each of you for your different perspectives on this, for the people who've organized this, and thank you so much for your attendance. I'm also, for my sins, which is a great privilege actually, I'm the chairman of the British Chamber of Business in Southern Africa, and the message we are giving to the British business working in Southern Africa now, that it is not an extractive, solution anymore. It is a contributive one where that when you come here, you participate and build prosperity. You don't take out. And that is the future of international business. That's the message we'll put through. There's a small token of our support for this initiative. We're going to offer some scholarships for the MBA and a couple of other programs, full scholarships for the Henley Earth Scholarship to support these actions, this movement. Stanley is a recipient of one of those. And hopefully we're going to get more. And Deepak, I hope that you will help us choose somebody that will get a full scholarship you think is a powerful activist and voice. That's worth about 320,000. We're going to give away R500,000 worth of scholarships completely funded by us to this cause. So that's the best we can do to thank you. And we've also offered Bright that thing. Anyone else who would like a nice little mic like that, give us a call, least we can do. And thank you so much for being here. And I look forward to talking again soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you to Henley and to Jonathan for hosting this, let's just call it dialogue, because that's what this is about. And absolutely right. Education, sharing of ideas, and we're in this together, all of us.
Okay, I see Zuzili has put up her hand. We have closed off, but Zuzili, go on. Let's go. Let's not be overly. Zuzili.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. I'm actually in the same group as Dr. Stanley Semelane. The name of our group in SA48 is Excelsior. So I was just supporting him, and I'm also a global shaper with Pato. So great to have her on the line as well. Just on the last comment you made about the scholarship, how does one apply?
Contact us. Just get hold of admissions. Contact. We'll be looking for new people into the programs, and also we can talk about some more. So let's look at that. We really want to promote these things and get people on it. So global shapers, welcome. Okay.
Thank you very much. So much.
And good luck in COP. Let us know if we can help at all. Deepak, we're right with you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Bye-bye, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, colleagues.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.